Hey guys, it's Ryan Dusich from DSX Motorsports, and I'm here to talk today about the AP Racing brake calipers. Okay, so in front of me, I've got the CP8350 4-piston brake caliper that I've been running on the WRX, and then next to that I have the new CP9660. This is the endurance caliper. So I've got these two here, and I've got the two rotors for each one of them, as well as you can see the support brackets. So just kind of want to give you guys a rundown a little bit about these brakes, what I liked about these, why I'm moving to these, and some other kind of interesting component ideas. So first, I'm going to start off with the 8350s. I really like these calipers. They treated me super good, and they're kind of my first foray into like a motorsports caliper, one that's not powder coated. I mean, you can see the paint that was on there where it said AP Racing, it's definitely heated out, but the rest of it, the anodizing, hard anodizing, everything, the whole finish on this whole caliper setup has really lasted, I mean, held up great through a whole season of motorsports. These are the rotors that I ran with these. These are two-piece rotors. So before, when I was running the Brembos, I was running a one-piece stop tech. So the rotors are quite a bit lighter, and the two-piece design is nice, and I got about 40 track days or so on these rotors, and I did find a crack in one of them today. But ultimately, the rotors, I say a crack, but like a crack over the radius. But overall, the rotors have held up really good, and the calipers have held up really good. Here you can see the brake pads here. This is a set of DS1.11s Ferrodos, but those are about 15 millimeters thick on each pad here. And from the Brembos, I think, which are about 11 or 9 millimeters of pad thickness, is a big step up in just pad life. On the Brembos, I was getting about 2 to 3 like hard braking track days out of a set of pads. From Hawks or G-Locks, and then when I went to the CP8350, I actually was getting upwards of like 10 to 12 hard track days, and that was with more power, higher top speeds, bigger and more aggressive braking zones and stuff last season. So these have really been, I mean, they've pretty much almost paid for themselves just in brake pads alone. And then we'll talk about the brake pad costs here in a second. You can see this nice billet piece that they have that they made. We'll get some close-ups on all this stuff here in a little bit, but this is actually a caliper bracket. It doesn't weigh too much. It's got bolts that thread into it, hardened bolts, bolts that thread through the machine piece there. And then, of course, the caliper is a 4-piston design. It uses a hardware that you basically pull out and drop the pads in and pull the pads out. Super easy to do. It was never really that hard at the track. Came with brake lines. One of them, so this is an original brake line that came with the kit, and this one I actually had to replace after a fire that we had at Road Atlanta. So that's pretty much everything about like the details about the 8350. One of the reasons why I'm bumping up to the Radi-cal is I want to remove brake ducts. So when I was running these with brake ducts, they were great. Had no problems with them. They'd get through a whole session. It would usually take about a lap or so to warm up the R16s that I used to run from G-Lock, maybe sometimes 2 laps. And I found that when I was racing, I really was closing some of the ducts. And then without the brake ducts, they would be great. They would warm up on my warm-up lap, but without the brake ducts, they would definitely start getting overheated after 4 or 5 aggressive laps. So I want to go to no brake ducts to try and reduce the front end drag on the car. So that's the biggest reason why I made the step from here to the Radi-cals. The Radi-cals require an 18-inch wheel, where the CP8350s can fit into a 17-inch wheel in this setup. And they do clear stock wheels, like the stock 17-inch BBS Brembos. So that's definitely a plus for this. But without the brake ducting, it doesn't take more than a couple of laps before it really starts even overheating the big pads. So move into this caliper. This is the CP99, or I think they call it so this is the 9660 So that's the 8 denotes the endurance frame. And with this caliper, we get 25 mil brake pads instead of the 15 mil brake pads. I wish I had one here to show you, but they're obviously quite a bit larger. They have a couple of options with the bridge. They have this bolt together bridge, which is probably what we will run. And then they've got a like a quick release pin that goes in here where you take this bridge out, and then it's got an actual spring clip, and you can move, pull the whole thing out that way. And this caliper, it doesn't weigh too much. And this caliper is actually really super light. So I would say that they're actually probably pretty close in weight. And that's with all the crazy stuff that's come out of this actual caliper to help keep the weight down. But I would imagine that that the pads alone will make up the difference on just the weight if there's any negligible weight. Like I said, this caliper feels extremely lightweight. This one obviously does too, even though it's much larger. But it honestly, this caliper, the 8350, might actually be lighter. So these are a 355 or a 325 millimeter rotor, 32. They come 32 millimeters thick, 70 vane. The Radi-cal setup is 355 millimeters, also 32 millimeters thick, and they do make them in up to a 34 and a 36 millimeter, and also 72 vane on this setup that we have right here. Sorry, losing my notes. Both of these rotors are dual drill for 5x100 and 5x114 cars. Both of these brackets work for WRX and STIs, so there shouldn't be any big changes there. So if you're looking at one of these two kits, I mean, you have the option on both platforms to run both of these kits. I run the big one, or the 1/16 or whatever the big master cylinder is, and I didn't notice any brake problems balance-wise with the CP8350. They actually advertise that the fluid size inside this caliper is actually made to work with the stock rear STI calipers, which is what I'm running. And that's the same thing too with the CP9660. So, talking about heat reduction, so I really am trying to run the car where I'm trying to make my fastest passes within my first or second lap, maybe my third lap. And a big reason of that is unfortunately has been longevity for the engine and drivetrain and everything of that sort. So without brake ducting, we should be able to get quite a bit more heat in this pad. We're going to start recommendation from Danny from G-Lock with an R12 on this pad first, but we'll be able to see how quick this pad actually warms up and how long it takes to overheat it. We really don't want to overheat the calipers or overheat the pads, but what we want is a quick warming up brake system that that without brake ducts can handle, you know, a couple extra laps or at least a 10 to 15 minute session. Here you can see the brake caliper bracket here, and this thing is just insanely lightweight. It actually weighs considerably less than this one here. You can see that they have the holes drilled out and everything. And then they have, these actually have ARP hardware studs that are built into them with caps, and where these are actually bolts through it. But the rest of it is pretty standardized there, where it goes through. The rotor itself probably actually weighs a little bit more. There are a big difference between, as far as size in the rotors, about 30 millimeters. So that does bring it to where now this system will only work with an 18-inch wheel package, which for us wasn't a big deal. We wanted to go to the 18-inch wheel package to go much wider. From last year, we were running 255s on a 17 by 9.5, and this year we're on 315s, running a 18 by 12. So we'll have a little extra mass to slow down with the wheels and tires and with the rotor itself, but hopefully the caliper itself works out. This caliper, like I said, is optimized to work with the still with the factory hydraulic system. So if you look into it, you can see that the pistons are much smaller, generally speaking, than the piston sizes in the 8350. And obviously they're both staggered, but you can see a few extra differences with the pistons about how they have kind of an air brake in between them for heat and and a couple of other little really cool, really clutch elements built into the caliper design too. And I do think that this bridge that comes across the top that the CP8350 doesn't have, you're gonna see that I think that this is gonna add quite a bit more stiffness to the caliper itself. Other than that, this is basically the system that we were running. I absolutely love it, 100%. And this is the system that we're going to. Now, the cost, really more the longevity of these pads, have really what have lent me to feel comfortable spending a big, I mean, it's a big chunk of difference between this setup, and even on consumables. It has led quite a bit. It has helped me be more comfortable moving into this brake package. When I was running the Brembos and we were getting, 2 to 3 track days out of a set of pads, the thought of spending, $500 on a set of pads and thinking they only last that long would be really crazy. The biggest reason I went, one of the many reasons I went to this setup, and is that the pads are cheaper for this more common design than they were for the Brembos. And of course, being thicker, the motorsports caliper, I mean, everything helped it last longer and helped bring the consumable cost down. And that even includes the rotors. The rotor rings are about $400 for the pair, so super cheap to rebuild. $50 for each caliper to rebuild the calipers from Essex. So super awesome customer service, and those guys are stellar, which is why I'm staying with the AP line. I'll give you guys some number rundowns essentially. So the CP8350, this is basically for the 02 to 2015 or whatever WRX and STI fitment. And really it'll fit the 17s as well. Is $2,599, and that's without pads. That's the retail price from Flatirons Tuning for this setup. Pads are gonna run, we'll talk about pads in just a second because there are actually some pretty impressive pad cost differences. You can get this setup with that'll hold up to the 18mm pads and not the 25mm pads, and that's the CP9660. It's also got the same rotor, the 35mm, the 355mm rotor. That's 32 inches thick, and that setup is only $4,199, so $4,200. However, when you make the jump from the non-endurance to the 9668, that does bring you up to about $4,600, so $4,599 from Flatirons Tuning. So it is still a $400 jump in price, but you are talking about 40% more pad. So other than like actual wheel clearance issues, maybe that could create a problem. It is pretty awesome that for $400 more, you can get a caliper frame that's quite a bit larger. And that brings me to really the craziest part about all of this. So first, we'll talk about brake pads. So I just kind of standardized it from a Flatirons site using the Ferrodo Ds1.11. Really common track pad. Great initial bite. It is a Ferrodo, and of course I didn't put the G-Lock prices on here or the hot prices, but this is just, they had all these literally listed straight down the line, so it's really easy for me to sort it out. So the Ferrodo pad, the DS111 for the factory Brembos, that's the 4-piston Brembos, that pad is $466.49 for a pad that's basically 11 mil or less of pad material on each side. Pretty expensive. The CP8350, and this is like where I talk about it really being a huge difference. The DS111 for that caliper is $239.53 retail. So for $240, you're getting essentially the DS111s in this frame at this thickness, which is about 15mm thickness. From my experience, it's also difference in 3 track days for $466 to 10 plus track days for $240. So you can see that just like the fact, and that one pad change in the lifetime that this pad lasts for a in the CP8350, that you're saving to go through that many pads on the Brembo kit. You're spending, so that's 3 sets of pads, that's $1,500 versus $239 for the same pad life. So for $1,500, like as you can see, these calipers will definitely pay for themselves in a year if you're really aggressive on track like I am. And I mean aggressive, not necessarily driving, but going out to events. So if it's, you're talking a $1,300 difference, literally in 20 track days, these calipers will have paid for themselves. So that's a big plus. And that brings us to the difference between the endurance and the non-endurance frame for the CP9660s and the 9668s. And this is really what's super crazy to me. So keep in mind that the Brembos for the DS111s are $466. When you go to the CP9660, the non-endurance frame, and that's an 18mm pad versus an 11mm pad, you're now paying even less, $462.34 retail for the same exact pad. This much, I mean, you can imagine how much larger surface area that you have, and 6-7 millimeters thicker per pad. So you're talking about a half an inch, at least a half an inch more pad on the non-endurance frame. And this is where it gets even crazier. The same pad for the endurance frame, 25 millimeters thick, so 40% more pad. Now you're talking the exact same price for those pads, $462.34. So just to kind of put that all into perspective, going to this brake setup for me is what really sold me on the idea that a motorsports caliper with proper pads can actually save you money. The pads that last longer, pads that are cheaper, and everything in that sort. These pads, the pads for these calipers are still cheaper than the Brembo calipers. Granted, this is a $4,200 or $4,600 setup, right? But still cheaper, and I'm still to be determined on how much pad life I'm going to get out of these things. But even when you go from this caliper to the endurance frame and the pads are the same price from Ferrodo, I mean, it's really hard to argue how long would it take for 40% more pad to pay for the difference between the regular frame and the endurance frame. And if it takes, 20 track days to just the cost difference in these pads to pay off this caliper, how many track days is it going to take to pay this caliper off? We'll find that out when we see actually how long it lasts. But I'm really hoping that one set of pads will get us through, 30 to 40 track days. And if you're looking at 30 to 40 track days, that's minimum 10 sets of pads, and they're the exact same price versus one set pad. So that's $4,600 in 10 sets of pads. So 10 sets of pads, 30 track days. If I can get 30 track days out of one set of pads on this caliper, they will literally pay for themselves in a year. So those are my compelling arguments for AP Racing. I absolutely love them. I love them over all the other motorsports brands, especially the customer service that you get with Essex in the US when you're getting caliper rebuilds for $50. And I don't know how much the friction rings are on these, but if I get to it, I'll add it into the comments or into the description. But the fact that the rotor rings are so much cheaper, the fact that those guys are really in-house, 2-week turnaround on the calipers from when they receive them to when they return or send them back out to you. So within 3 weeks, you can send your caliper in, get it rebuilt, and receive it back. I mean, you just don't get customer service like that with some of the other brake companies, not that I've been aware of. And you get this beautiful, beautiful caliper. I mean, this thing is absolutely gorgeous. And yeah, really, really excited. Really excited to run this this setup this year. So thanks for checking us out. Thanks for listening to what we had to say about the AP Racing brakes, and give them a check. Hit up Flatirons. I'll put down the part numbers for basically the 3 kits available and that I talked about today, and give them a consideration, especially if you're just starting to get into this track day stuff. These things performed better than my Brembos. They weren't a step down. They might look a little bit smaller, but they outperformed my Brembos, and they were amazing. So I'm super excited to see how this caliper is going to do for us. And then we'll do some close-ups on all this stuff that we got up on the table, and we'll see you guys at the track.